The first credit card bill arrived in a name I hadn't used in years, my full legal name, the one on my birth certificate. He'd opened it 2 weeks prior with a $50,000 limit, already maxed out. My son-in-law thought his retired father-in-law wouldn't notice. What he didn't know is that I spent 32 years as an IRS criminal investigation agent, and I built his federal case for him. My name is Thomas Shaw. For over 3 decades, my job was to follow the money for the United States government, to unravel the most sophisticated frauds imaginable. In retirement, I thought my greatest threat was boredom. I was wrong. The threat was in my own family, and he just made the single most professional mistake of his life. He underestimated me. This is not a story about a family argument. This is a forensic reconstruction of a federal crime, built piece by piece by the one man he never thought would be watching. My daughter Sarah married Mark 5 years ago. He was charming, ambitious, always with a new business idea. I saw the ambition, sure, but I missed the desperation hiding just beneath it. He worked in commercial real estate, or at least that's what he told everyone. The deals were always just about to close, the big commission perpetually 60 days out. I helped them with their down payment on a condo. It was a gift, but I structured it properly. A documented gift letter, everything above board. That's just how my mind works. I believed in supporting family, but I also believed in clean paper trails. The first real red flag was subtle. 18 months ago, Mark asked to borrow $12,000, a short-term bridge he called it, to cover business expenses until a property flipped. He was my son-in-law. He looked me in the eye and promised a repayment date. I wrote the check. I even noted it in my personal ledger. The date came and went. When I gently asked Sarah about it, she got defensive. She said Mark was under tremendous pressure, that I didn't understand his business. So I let it go. I told myself it was just money. But in my world, money is never just money. It's a signal. A broken financial promise is the first crack in the foundation. Then the favors started becoming more frequent. Could I co-sign a line of credit for his business? The bank would trust my retirement history. I said no, firmly but politely. He needed to use my address for some business mail because he and Sarah were between places. I said no. Each refusal was met with a slightly colder smile, a hint of resentment he couldn't quite mask. I was no longer just a father-in-law. I was an obstacle. Sarah became more distant. Our weekly dinners dwindled. When we did talk, she'd parrot Mark's frustrations about how hard it was to get ahead, how the system was rigged. I heard the language of grievance settling in, and it chilled me. The discovery wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday. I was reviewing my consolidated financial statements online, a habit from my old job. My credit score had dropped 34 points. That got my attention. I pulled a full report, and there it was. A credit card issued by First Premier Bank, opened 3 weeks prior. The mailing address was a P.O. box in a town 40 miles away. The listed phone number had 1 digit different from mine. It was a sloppy, hasty fabrication. But the name was exact. Thomas James Shaw, my social security number. He'd already utilized 89% of the $50,000 limit. Cash advances, electronics purchases, a hefty charge from a luxury resort in Scottsdale. A vacation Sarah had told me they got a great deal on. The feeling wasn't anger at first. It was a profound, hollow coldness. A professional detachment clicked into place. This was a crime scene. My identity was the victim, and the prime suspect lived in my daughter's home. I printed everything. I created a new folder on my computer, encrypted it. I began a log just as I'd done on hundreds of federal investigations. Date, time, observation. But this time, the subject was family. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. A confrontation would only cause denial, deletion of evidence, a unified front against me. Instead, I began to quietly investigate the man I'd broken bread with. I started with public records. Property records showed liens I didn't know about. A business registration for a shell company with a name similar to his, but not exactly. I used paid databases, the same ones I used in my career, my retired credentials still granting access. The picture that emerged was of a house of cards. multiple maxed-out credit cards in his and Sarah's names, 2 civil judgments for unpaid debts, a pattern of using one line of credit to pay the minimum on another, the classic spiral of a drowning man. And then I found the second one. Another credit card, this one from a different bank, opened in my name just 1 week after the first. Another $25,000 limit already half gone. He was accelerating. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was burning through my credit as fast as he could, a financial smash and grab. He was operating under the assumption that an old man checks his statements quarterly, if at all. He didn't know I checked mine weekly. He didn't know I had alerts set up for any hard inquiry on my social. I had to see the full scope. I placed a fraud alert with all 3 major bureaus. I requested official copies of every application. The signatures were crude forgeries. The income was inflated, listing my IRS pension but doubling it. He'd even listed my home as an asset, claiming he had ownership interest. That's when the cold detachment began to thaw, replaced by a simmering, focused rage. He wasn't just stealing money. He was putting a lien on my entire life's work, on the home I'd built with my late wife. I needed to understand his endgame. What was the pressure point? I pieced it together from fragments. A call I overheard Sarah make, her voice strained, talking about managing the callers. A registered letter from a law firm I saw on their kitchen counter during a brief visit. Mark was being sued, personally, for a substantial debt. The clock was ticking for him. My credit lines weren't for luxury. They were a desperate attempt to stave off a financial collapse that would swallow him and my daughter whole. I faced a choice no parent should ever have to make. Do I intervene with a check and enable the behavior? Do I let them crash and burn and hope Sarah survives the wreckage? Or do I treat this like what it is, a federal crime? My professional oath screamed one thing. My father's heart screamed another. I spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with it. I made my decision. I would not write a check. I would not bail him out. But I would also not pick up the phone and call my old colleagues at IRS Criminal Investigation. Not yet. I would give him a single, clear chance to stop, to come clean, to undo what he could. It was more mercy than he deserved and more than any other target of my investigations had ever gotten. I invited them over for dinner, just the 3 of us. I cooked Sarah's favorite meal. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Mark was overly cheerful, talking about a new big deal. Sarah was quiet, picking at her food. After dessert, I led us into the living room. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed 2 printed pages on the coffee table. The first page was the summary of the first Premier credit card account in my name. The second was a screenshot of the luxury resort charge. I looked at Mark and said, "You have one chance to explain this to me." The color drained from his face. Sarah looked at the papers, then at him, her expression a confused horror. Mark's eyes darted from the papers to me, and in that moment I didn't see a son-in-law. I saw a cornered predator. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. His face hardened and he said the words that changed everything. "You have no proof that was me. Anyone could have stolen your information. Maybe you're getting senile and forgot you applied for it." He was not confessing. He was not seeking mercy. He was going to war. And in that moment, my father's heart finally broke clean away, leaving only the investigator. He just lied to my face, and in doing so, he'd handed me the first piece of tactical evidence I needed: intent. Now it was no longer a family problem. It was a case, and I was just getting started. The morning after that dinner, I didn't call my daughter. I didn't rage. I sat at my home desk, the same one where I'd closed dozens of cases, and I began to build a file that would survive in a federal courtroom. The first rule of financial investigation: secure the evidence chain. I placed a full freeze on my credit with all 3 bureaus. I filed formal identity theft affidavits with each bank, but I was careful in my wording. I reported the accounts as fraudulent, but I did not name a suspect. Not yet. I needed the banks to conduct their own inquiries, to create their own paper trail independent of mine. Next, I subpoenaed myself, figuratively. Using legal public records access tools, I pulled every document associated with my name and social security number from the last 18 months. I was looking for the application footprints. The online applications for those credit cards would have an IP address, a digital fingerprint pointing to a specific internet connection. I couldn't get that myself, but a federal subpoena could. I logged the date, time, and method of every request I made. This was no longer a personal ledger. This was an evidence log. I also knew I had to follow the money. Where was the cash going? The luxury resort charge was a clue. I hired a discreet, licensed private investigator with experience in financial tracing. I gave him the account numbers, the merchant details. His job was to follow the public trail, to see if those resort charges matched a real reservation, to see if the electronics purchases were shipped to an address. I directed him from the shadows, using the language of the trade. We never met in person. All communication was encrypted. I was treating my own son-in-law like a hostile foreign asset. Meanwhile, the family fallout was immediate and brutal. Sarah called me crying. "How could you accuse him of this, Dad? He's devastated. He says you're having a paranoid episode." I listened. I heard the manipulation in her voice. The script Mark had undoubtedly fed her. I said, "Sarah, I showed him factual documents." His reaction was to call me senile. Ask yourself why that was his first defense. The line went quiet. Then she said, "I don't know what to believe anymore," and hung up. That hurt more than anything. My daughter was choosing to stand in the fog of doubt rather than see the clear evidence in front of her. 2 weeks passed. The investigator came back with his first report. The resort charges did match a reservation, under the name Mark and Sarah Thompson, but paid for with the credit card in my name. He'd been brazen enough to use his real first name. The electronics had been shipped to a UPS store box, rented under a fake business name, but paid for with a debit card linked to an account I traced back to Mark's shell company. The connections were indirect, but they were there. A mosaic of fraud was forming. Then I received the golden ticket. One of the banks, as part of its fraud investigation, sent me a copy of the application. It included a field for previous address. He'd listed my address correctly, but for current address, he'd used the P.O. box. And in the tiny print at the bottom was the IP address from which the application was submitted. A string of numbers. That was the needle. That IP address could be tied to an internet service provider account. And that account would have a name and a physical address on file. I couldn't access that link. That required a law enforcement subpoena. But I now had the direct, tangible evidence that could justify one. I compiled everything into a pristine chronological dossier. The fraudulent applications, the financial statements showing the transfers and purchases, the investigator's report linking the purchases to Mark, the IP address. I wrote a concise summary laying out the case as I would for a junior agent. Suspect, means, motive, opportunity, and evidence. Motive was overwhelming debt and pending litigation. Opportunity was access to my personal data through family gatherings. Means was his familiarity with financial processes. The evidence was now sitting in a 3-inch thick binder on my desk. But here was the ethical razor's edge I was walking. By taking this to the authorities, I was not just accusing Mark. I was potentially destroying my daughter's life, her marriage, her financial stability, her future. The weight of that was paralyzing. I spent another week in purgatory, the binder staring at me from the desk. I thought about my late wife. What would she have wanted? Protection for her daughter, absolutely, but also justice. She hated a liar. The decision was made for me. Mark escalated. He must have felt the walls closing in from his own creditors because he attempted another line of attack. I received a call from my home equity loan bank. There was an inquiry about accessing the equity in my house. Someone had called, posing as me, asking about the process. The bank representative became suspicious when the caller couldn't answer basic security questions about my mortgage history. They flagged it and called the number on file me. He was moving from unsecured credit to trying to steal the equity out of my home. This was no longer just about cash flow. This was about asset stripping. He was trying to mortgage my past to pay for his present. The sheer audacity of it, the risk, told me he was in a terminal financial panic. A desperate man is a dangerous man. He was no longer just a thief. He was an arsonist, willing to burn my entire financial life to the ground to warm himself for one more winter. That was the pivot, the bridge from a family crime to a clear and present danger. My hesitation evaporated. I wasn't just protecting my credit score anymore. I was protecting the home I owned, the legacy I would one day leave for my daughter, and frankly, I was protecting Sarah from being legally tied to the catastrophic fraud her husband was committing. I made an appointment, not with the local police. Identity theft of this scale, crossing state lines via the internet, involving financial institutions federally insured, this was federal. This was for the agency I knew best. I walked into the field office of the United States Postal Inspection Service. Why them? Because the fraud used the mail, credit cards, statements were mailed. Their jurisdiction was rock solid, and I knew they worked hand in glove with the IRS on financial crimes. I asked to speak to an inspector. I was calm, direct. I said, "I am a retired IRS special agent. I'm here to report a major identity theft and wire fraud scheme, and I have brought the case file with me." The demeanor of the receptionist changed instantly. I was ushered into a small interview room. An inspector entered, a man in his 40s with a sharp, assessing gaze. I slid the binder across the table. For the next 2 hours, I walked him through it, not as a victim. As a former colleague, I spoke the language. I pointed out the evidence chain. I highlighted the IP address, the nexus for a subpoena. I explained the suspect's motive and his access. The inspector, whose name was Garcia, listened intently, asking precise questions. He didn't offer sympathy. He evaluated. And at the end of it, he closed the binder and said, "This is one of the most victim-prepared packages I've ever seen. It's actionable." Those words, "it's actionable," meant the bridge was crossed. The machinery of the federal government would now engage. Inspector Garcia took custody of my binder. He explained the process. They would subpoena the internet provider for the name behind the IP address. They would subpoena the banks for all application data and transaction records. They would likely involve the Secret Service, who also have jurisdiction over significant financial crimes. My role, for now, was to be silent, to not alert the suspect, to document any further contact. I walked out of that federal building into the afternoon sun. There was no relief, only the quiet, grim certainty of a trap being set. The investigation was no longer mine. It was the government's, and I had just handed them the blueprint. I drove home, feeling completely alone. The silence in my house was absolute. I had done it. I had turned my family in. The call came 3 days later. It was Sarah, but her voice was different. No tears, no accusations. It was small and hollow and terrified. "Dad," she whispered, "Mark's car is gone. He packed a bag this morning and said he had to meet a business partner out of state. He won't answer his phone, and 2 men in suits were just here. They showed me badges. They asked me questions about you, about your finances. What did you do?" The shock in her voice was genuine. Mark hadn't told her he was running. The federal inquiry had spooked him, and he'd abandoned her to face it alone. My daughter was now in the crosshairs of an investigation, terrified and confused. And in that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. My careful, professional case had just achieved its first major result. It had turned my son-in-law into a fugitive, and it had left my daughter standing in the wreckage, looking at me as if I were a stranger. The chess pieces were in motion, and there was no taking a move back. The game was now about damage control, and the collateral damage was sitting in my daughter's empty living room, waiting for a husband who was never coming home. I told Sarah to stay in her house. I told her not to touch anything, not to answer the door for anyone but me. I was there in 15 minutes. The look on her face when she opened the door wasn't just fear. It was the shattered realization that the man she'd married was a ghost, and he'd been haunting both of us. The condo was in disarray. Drawers were half open. A suitcase was missing. Mark had done a hurried but thorough scrub of his personal electronics. His laptop was gone. His old tablets gone, but he'd left the debris of his chaos behind. Piles of unopened bills, final demand notices from collection agencies, court summons for lawsuits I never knew about. The scale of his debt was staggering, easily climbing into the mid-6 figures. Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, holding a framed wedding photo, her hands shaking. "He said they were business rivals trying to scare him," she whispered, pointing to a lawsuit. "He said the credit card bills were mistakes he was disputing." She'd been living in a narrative he'd built for her, a house of lies where every red flag was explained away as bad luck or persecution. My meticulous case file had been the wrecking ball that finally shattered the facade. Her grief was immediately followed by a tidal wave of panic. "Am I in trouble, Dad? The men with badges, am I going to be arrested?" I hugged her the first time she'd let me in years. "No, honey," I said, my voice firm. "You're a victim too, but you need to get a lawyer today." That was the first hard truth. She was not a suspect in the identity theft, but she was legally entangled in his financial mess. His debts, taken out in their joint names, were now hers. His flight made him look guilty of everything, and it painted a target on everything they owned together. I called Inspector Garcia on the spot. I reported Mark's disappearance. Garcia's tone was clinical. "Flight is indicative of consciousness of guilt. This elevates the case. We'll issue a be on the lookout bulletin." "Does your daughter have any idea where he might go?" Sarah didn't. She knew nothing about his business contacts, his friends. It was a horrifying admission. She'd been married to a stranger. The next 48 hours were a blur of grim logistics. I helped Sarah find a reputable attorney who specialized in both financial crime and divorce. We secured her accounts, what little was left in them. We changed the locks, and we waited. The federal machinery was now turning at full speed. The subpoena on the IP address came back. It was assigned to an account registered to Mark's shell company at a virtual office address. A dead end for locating him, but a direct, forensic link placing him at the keyboard that submitted the fraudulent application. It was the digital smoking gun. Then the second wave hit. It wasn't just credit cards. Inspector Garcia called me back, his voice carrying a new, graver weight. "Mr. Shaw, our forensic accountants have been tracing the flows from the accounts in your name. The money didn't just go to vacations and TVs. A significant portion was laundered through a series of shell corporations and then used as collateral to obtain a loan." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What kind of loan?" "A business loan," Garcia said, "for $250,000, issued by a small private lender. The application used your stolen identity, your fabricated financials, and it used your home as purported collateral." He'd done it. He'd actually managed to secure a massive loan by fraudulently pledging my house. The lender, seeing what looked like a solid retiree's assets on paper, had advanced the funds. Mark had then taken that money and vanished. The private lender was now out $250,000, and they believed they had a legal claim against my property. My carefully built case had just expanded from identity theft to major wire fraud and now to real estate fraud. The stakes were no longer about my credit. They were about losing my home entirely. This was the "it gets worse" moment. The collateral damage was exploding. I was now facing a civil lawsuit from a furious lender, a company that would fight viciously to recoup its loss by any means possible. My home was in legal jeopardy, and all of this was happening while my daughter's life imploded and my son-in-law was a fugitive somewhere in the wind. My retirement calm was gone, replaced by the old, familiar battlefield focus. I engaged a civil litigation attorney to fight the lender's claim. Simultaneously, I worked with Garcia and the now-involved Secret Service to use every tool to find Mark. We analyzed his last known financial movements. He'd withdrawn $15,000 in cash the morning he fled. He used an ATM at a truck stop 200 miles away, heading south. He was running, but he was still spending, which meant he'd leave a trail. Sarah, under her lawyer's advice, began the painful process of separating herself legally and financially. She provided everything she had: emails, texts, old files to the federal investigators. She was cooperating fully, a victim desperate to distance herself from the crater he'd left. The emotional whiplash was brutal. One day she was angry at me for starting this. The next she was sobbing in gratitude that I was there. We were navigating a minefield in the dark. 2 weeks after his disappearance, the break we needed came from an unexpected place. The luxury resort in Scottsdale, the one he'd charged to my card. Inspector Garcia had subpoenaed their full guest records. Mark had been there 3 times in the past year, and he hadn't been alone. The records showed a second guest on 2 of those visits, a woman's name, not Sarah's. When Garcia told me and then reluctantly told Sarah with me present, it was the final brutal betrayal. The fraud, the theft, the fleeing, those were crimes. This was a personal detonation. The man had been funding an affair with the money he stole from me. Sarah crumpled. It was the detail that severed the last fragile thread of hope or sympathy she'd been clinging to. Her marriage was not just a lie built on debt. It was a lie built on contempt. This revelation, however, gave the investigation a new lead. The woman, they tracked her down. She was a real estate agent from a neighboring state, someone Mark had met through business. She was shocked, she claimed, to learn he was married. She provided phone records, texts. She gave them the last number he'd used to contact her, a burner phone. And that burner phone had pinged a cell tower in Texas just 3 days prior. The net was tightening. The U.S. Marshals were now involved in the fugitive hunt. Mark was no longer just a family villain. He was a federal target with multiple felony warrants. The case file was inches thick, and I, the victim, was also the chief architect of the entire prosecution. My binder was the foundation for what was now a multi-agency operation. Then the call came, not from law enforcement, from a blocked number. I answered, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was him. Mark's voice was thin, stretched with panic, coming through a bad connection. Tom, you need to call them off. You need to tell them it was all a misunderstanding, a family thing. You're destroying everything. I didn't speak for a moment. I let his desperation hang in the silence. Then I said calmly, there's no misunderstanding, Mark. You stole my identity. You committed federal crimes. You left my daughter to face the consequences. You are a fugitive. The only thing left to discuss is your surrender. He swore, a raw, ugly sound. You think you're so smart. That house isn't yours anymore. That lender is going to take it. I made sure of it. You'll both be ruined. And he hung up. The call was a gift. It was more evidence of his consciousness of guilt. And it revealed his endgame, to burn it all down so no one could have anything. He wanted me and Sarah to drown in the chaos he'd created, but he'd miscalculated. The call was traceable, and it gave me one final, crucial piece of insight. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a cornered rat lashing out. He was making mistakes. I immediately called Inspector Garcia and reported the call. They traced it to a prepaid phone purchased at a big box store outside of Houston. The marshals were on the ground there within hours. The noose was now physically around his neck, hundreds of miles away. The pressure was at its peak. My home was under legal attack from the lender. My daughter was a shell of herself, starting divorce proceedings. And the man who caused it all was hiding in Texas, making desperate calls. We were in the eye of the hurricane. The forces I had set in motion were now larger than me, larger than my family. They had a momentum of their own. I sat in my quiet living room, the same room where Mark had once sat for holiday dinners, and I understood the final, irreversible truth. This would not end with a quiet conversation or a private repayment plan. It would end in a federal courtroom. There would be a trial. I would have to testify. Sarah might have to testify. Our family's deepest shame and betrayal would become a matter of public record. The private war had gone nuclear, and the fallout would be permanent. The only question left was whether the justice we got would be worth the peace we had lost. The gavel was about to fall, and there was no turning back. The United States Marshals found him in a rented condo outside of Houston, living off fast food and the last of the stolen cash. He didn't resist. He just looked tired. The man who thought he could outsmart the system was now in the system, and it had his number. Mark was extradited back to our district, remanded into federal custody with no bail. A flight risk and a demonstrable threat to the victim. That was me. The legal process, once set in motion, moved with a slow, grinding inevitability. The federal prosecutor, a woman named Anya Vance, took over. She was formidable. She saw my case file and recognized it for what it was, a prosecutor's dream pre-assembled. She added her own layers, forensic accounting that traced every dollar, expert testimony on digital footprints, evidence from the woman in Scottsdale that established a pattern of deceit beyond the financial. The charges were staggering: aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering. Each count carried years in prison, and they were stacking them high. My role shifted from investigator to key witness. I met with Vance for hours preparing my testimony. We went over every document, every date. She warned me the defense would try to paint me as a bitter, controlling father-in-law, as someone who had set Mark up or who was confused. She told me to stick to the facts, to let the documents speak, to be the unshakable professional on the stand. That I knew how to do. The civil case with the private lender was resolved first. My attorney dismantled their claim. We demonstrated with the federal indictment as evidence that their loan was procured through a comprehensive fraud. The signature on the deed of trust was a forgery. They had no valid claim to my home. Faced with the prospect of being seen as victims of Mark's fraud themselves, they settled quickly, dropping all claims in exchange for a promise not to sue them for their lax due diligence. My home was safe. The foundation held. Then came the criminal trial. Walking into that federal courthouse, with its marble floors and high ceilings, I felt the weight of the institution. This was where I had testified many times, but never with my own family sitting in the gallery. Sarah was there every day, supported by her therapist and a close friend. She needed to see it end. Mark sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't fit quite right, his lawyer whispering to him constantly. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision. Bank officials testified about the fraudulent applications. A digital forensics expert explained the IP address link. Inspector Garcia detailed the investigation. Then it was my turn. I took the oath. I sat in the witness box. Vance led me through the chronology, from the first credit card bill to the dinner confrontation to the discovery of the loan. I was calm, precise. I referenced exhibit numbers. I explained financial terms for the jury. I was, as I had been for 32 years, an agent of the facts. The defense attorney's cross-examination was exactly as Vance predicted. He tried to imply I had given Mark permission to help manage my finances. He suggested family discord. He asked if I felt betrayed. I answered only the questions posed. No, I did not give him permission. The documents show the fraud began before any family tension. My feelings are not entered into evidence. The documents are. He grew frustrated. I remained a stone wall. The facts were my fortress. The most powerful moment came when Vance played the recorded jailhouse call. The one where Mark had threatened me, saying the lender would take my house. Hearing his voice, filled with venom and panic, in the silent courtroom was devastating. I saw Sarah flinch. I saw the jury's faces harden. It was the sound of guilt, naked and ugly. Mark did not take the stand in his own defense. His lawyer gave a closing argument that pleaded for sympathy, calling it a family tragedy blown out of proportion. Anya Vance's closing was a surgical strike. She held up my original binder. The defendant picked the wrong victim, she said. He didn't steal from a confused elderly man. He stole from a federal investigator who knows how to build a case. And build it he did. She walked the jury through each element of each crime, connecting it to the evidence. It was a masterclass. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was a different kind of solemn. Victim impact statements were allowed. Sarah wrote one, but she couldn't bring herself to read it aloud. The prosecutor read it for her. It spoke of betrayal, of financial ruin, of emotional devastation. Then it was my turn. I stood before the judge. I didn't speak of anger. I spoke of the violation. I spoke of the profound breach of trust that extends beyond family into the very identity a person spends a lifetime building. I told the judge that the numbers in the indictment, the $75,000 in credit, the $250,000 loan, they weren't just numbers. They were a measurement of the life he tried to steal. a life I had spent decades building honestly. The judge, a stern man with decades on the bench, listened intently. He reviewed the sentencing guidelines. He noted the severity of the crimes, the sophistication, the fact that the victim was a family member and a senior. He noted Mark's lack of remorse, his attempt to flee. And then he handed down the sentence, 120 months in federal prison, 10 years, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay restitution to me and to the defrauded lender, a sum totaling $327,000, a debt he will likely never repay. Mark showed no emotion as they led him away. Sarah let out a long, shaky breath, as if she'd been holding it for a year. It was over. The aftermath was not a celebration. It was a reconstruction. Sarah moved into a small apartment. She took back her maiden name. She started seeing a therapist weekly. The divorce was finalized on paper, a straightforward proceeding given the criminal conviction. The financial mess took years to fully untangle. She filed for bankruptcy to discharge the joint debts he had piled in her name. It was a necessary, humbling fresh start. I helped her, but I was careful not to infantilize her. I offered financial advice when she asked. I costed a lease for her new apartment. I became a steady, quiet presence, not a manager of her life. Our relationship, fractured for so long, began to heal slowly with a new honesty between us. We had both seen the worst, and we were still here. Now for the surprising detail, the final twist. A year after the sentencing, Sarah came to me with an idea. She wanted to go back to school, not for something generic, but to become a certified financial counselor, specifically to help victims of elder financial fraud and identity theft. She said, "I lived with a predator. I saw how he operated, how he groomed me, how he lied. I want to use that to help people like you see it coming." My tough, resilient daughter was taking the poison of her experience and turning it into medicine for others. She wasn't just surviving, she was building a new purpose from the wreckage. That was the victory I never saw coming. As for me, I still live in my home. The oak tree in the backyard is taller. I installed a new, sophisticated security system, more for peace of mind than necessity. My credit has been fully restored, a long process of affidavits and letters. I occasionally have coffee with Inspector Garcia. We don't talk about the case much. We talk about fishing. The story ends here in this quiet space after the storm. The promise of the hook has been paid. The son-in-law who committed identity theft against the retired IRS agent is in federal prison. The agent built the case and the system delivered the consequence. It is a clean, closed loop, but the real resolution was never about punishment. It was about integrity. It was about proving that the foundation you spend a lifetime building, your name, your credit, your home, your principles, can withstand an assault, even from within your own family. You just have to be willing to defend it, brick by brick, document by document, no matter how painful the fight. The gavel fell. The sentence was served. And in the quiet that followed, two people picked up the pieces and began to build again, this time on a foundation of hard truth. The lesson was etched in law and in memory. Trust is a gift, but vigilance is a duty. Now, let's talk about what this story means for you. So what does this story, this collision of family and federal law, actually tell us? It tells us that the most dangerous predators often don't lurk in dark alleyways. They sit at our dinner tables. They know our routines, our vulnerabilities, the sacred trust we place in the word family. My case is not an anomaly. It is a stark example of a silent epidemic. Every year, older Americans lose an estimated $28.3 billion to financial exploitation. And in nearly half of all reported cases, the perpetrator is a family member, an adult child, a spouse, a son-in-law. The weapon isn't a gun, it's access. It's a sense of entitlement disguised as love. It's the quiet assumption that an older person's assets are just sitting there, waiting to be repurposed for someone else's emergency, someone else's dream, someone else's failure. We tell ourselves, they would never do that. But the data and my own experience screams otherwise. The greatest risk factor for elder financial abuse isn't wealth, it's isolation. It's the reluctance to believe someone you love could see you not as a person, but as a portfolio. This is why the lesson here extends far beyond my own victory in court. It's about proactive defense. If you are over 60 or you have a loved one who is, your financial vigilance must become a non-negotiable routine. Check your credit reports quarterly, not annually. Use a free service to lock your credit when you aren't applying for loans. Never, ever share your social security number or online banking passwords, no matter how convincing the plea. Document everything. If someone asks for money, even your own child, treat it like a business transaction. Get the terms in writing. A genuine request for help will withstand a little scrutiny. A predatory one will collapse under it. And if you discover you are a victim, you must silence the shame. The shame is the predator's best friend. It keeps you quiet, it keeps you compliant. You must report it to the police, to the Federal Trade Commission, to the Adult Protective Services in your state. And yes, if it involves taxes or significant fraud, to the IRS Criminal Investigation Tip Line. These crimes thrive in darkness. Shine the brightest light you can on them. You are not betraying your family by protecting yourself. They betrayed you the moment they decided to steal from you. My story had a rare element. I had the training to fight back on equal footing. Most victims don't. They feel confused, overwhelmed, and heartbroken. That's why the aftermath, my daughter Sarah's choice to become a financial counselor for elder victims, feels like the most meaningful justice of all. She is turning our family's pain into a shield for others. That is how we break the cycle. Not just with prison sentences, but with education, with empowerment, with the courage to have difficult conversations about money and boundaries before a crisis ever begins. In the end, this isn't just a story about catching a criminal. It's a story about reclaiming agency. Your name, your credit, your life's work, they are your own. Guard them with the same ferocity you would guard your front door against a stranger. Because sometimes the threat isn't a stranger at all. It's someone who knows where you keep the key. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who needs to hear it, please share it. And if you want more deep dives into the systems that protect us and the people who break them, make sure to subscribe. Your attention is the foundation of everything we do here. Until next time.